What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, live for your 2022 NFL free agency position by position preview. In this video, I'm going to break down every position in free agency from quarterback to nickel. We are going to discuss the top 10 players, rank them at every position. I'm going to give you buyer beware players to look for, as well as the undervalued free agents at each position, and just give you an overall idea of the players that can fit your favorite team, their schemes, and their roster to fill their needs this offseason. Personally, I am more of a free agent guy. I'm more of a free agency guy than I am a draft guy. I enjoy the free agency more because I have more of an understanding of the players in the NFL at this moment, how good, how talented they are, than I do the prospects typically, because I'm not a huge college football guy because I cover the NFL year round. So free agency for me is a very exciting time because it allows me to look at all of these players, evaluate all of these players, not just the best players at every position as you would in a top 10 quarterbacks list or a top 10 running backs list, but actually going in depth on the third running back on a depth chart or the fourth corner on a depth chart, the third linebacker, and those are things that I enjoy. So if you enjoy that as well, don't forget to spike that like button. Also subscribe to the channel for more NFL free agency talk just like this. And get in that comment section. Let me know your thoughts. And I did leave a poll up there for you guys to answer. Which position are really you looking forward to the most in this video? Which position does your favorite team need the most? Where are their needs? Is it quarterback? Is it the wide receiver position? Is it corner? Is it pass rusher? Let me know in the comments. And also let me know some guys that you think are good fits for your favorite team. What's going on, Easy Smarts? What's going on, Natasha? Let me know how you guys are doing, how you guys are feeling. I went live for that purpose. So if you have any questions about a specific player, a specific fit, a specific scheme that you think this player might fit or not, then let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to answer your question. I won't get to every single free agent, but I'll get to pretty much all of the marquee free agents across the NFL this offseason. So before I get started, guys, do make sure that you are following me on Twitter, because Twitter is a great spot for me to release all my stuff, all my videos. I always tweet out when my latest video is out. I tweet out my thoughts across the NFL and when things break and things happen. And free agency, it happens on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, man, and you're an NFL fan, you're missing out, because that's where really the stuff breaks first, from Ian Rappaport to Adam Schefter. And then I'll give you my thoughts immediately as well before I even hit a video to the channel. So make sure you are following me at Mitch Milani on Twitter for the latest in NFL free agency time if you want my latest thoughts, and when I go live or when I put out a new video. Thank you, Natasha. Appreciate that. Let's go. Okay, so let's begin with the quarterback position. And before I even get to the quarterback position, I do have a couple more things to say. I do feel like this free agency crop, or this free agency class, is not super strong. I thought last year was super strong, really across the board from every position. I recall a very good group of pass rushers and some receivers as well, and even quarterbacks. The last couple of seasons has been pretty stacked in free agency. But this year, you look at all the positions, and I feel like the strongest position groups are the wide receiver position group. As always, there are a lot of great receivers in the NFL, and you can find a lot of them in free agency. Tight end, I actually think, is a very good group this year. Even deeper than just the top 10, I think you can find a starting tight end in this free agency. There's about 15 of them, in my opinion. Maybe some are better than others, but there's certainly a lot of them. Offensive line, I think, is a really good group for free agency. Not in terms of just the elite players, but also there's a lot of depth on the offensive line where you could potentially find a steal or two or a couple of starters more so than just one game-breaking tackle or game-breaking guard like maybe you've seen in the past. And I think the secondary groups are very strong as well. So cornerback is extremely strong. I think especially the top 3 corners are very good. And then we look at the depth of the position at perimeter corner and at nickel corner. There are guys to be had for starters out there. And then safety, there are like 5 to 6 elite players at this position that are potential free agents. On top of those elite players, safety is always a position where you can find value. The NFL is kind of weird in the way that they value safety. I feel stronger about safety and the importance of the position than really the NFL has over the last few years in how they're paying these players. So that's why they always become free agents, because a lot of these guys are being signed to short-term contracts for not a lot of money. But you can always find good safeties on the open market, and that is no different this year. So this video will only include unrestricted free agents, not restricted free agents, only the guys that will be open to the market. So guys that are restricted and have team rights are not going to be able to be in this video or in these rankings. I'm going to give you the top 10 players at every position. And these are my rankings personally. These are not based on stats. They're not based on PFF rankings or ratings. They're not based on anything but my own opinion. And then lastly, this is really more of a outline for you to understand the best players at the position. You know, I could definitely move, number 6 on the list to number 8 or number 8 to number 4. It's kind of more of an outline to see the best players. And within every position, there's always certain players that will fit certain teams better than others. For example, at the corner position, some guys are better in zone than in man coverage, or at the edge position, maybe a guy is bigger and maybe a guy smaller and quicker, and depending on that skill set, they'll fit a certain team better. So just keep that in mind, and I'll be able to remind you that before we even get to the position. So let's get to the quarterback position to start, because that is the position that is the most important in football. And like I said, I don't think this year is a super strong group. I think you can certainly find a couple guys. I think when you look at the quarterback position this year, it's a position where there's going to be a lot of targets through the trade market. So we know that Aaron Rodgers, we know that Russell Wilson, we know that Deshaun Watson, we potentially might even see a guy like Carson Wentz, Jimmy Garoppolo, or Kirk Cousins be traded this offseason, and maybe even more players in that market. So the trade market is really where you're going to find a lot of the bigger names, as we saw with Matthew Stafford last year. This year, for the free agency, there's a lot of borderline starter types, there's a lot of high-end backups, and there's a lot of bridge starters is the way that I would categorize it, and maybe a couple long shot gamble type of players that you can maybe sign to your team this offseason for maybe a team that has a younger starter that maybe they want to challenge them and see if they can push them to be better players. And then if that guy doesn't work out, to go with a cheaper alternative at the position. So that's the way I look at the quarterback position this free agency. Let's get to that top 10 quarterback group. So the top 10 quarterback group for me is number 1, Jameis Winston. We have Mitchell Trubisky, Marcus Mariota, Teddy Bridgewater, Tyrod Taylor, Andy Dalton, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Cam Newton, Jacoby Brissett, and Colt McCoy. There are a couple other players out there like Geno Smith and Blaine Gabbert. Now, personally, when I look at this position for the quarterback, I think Jameis Winston is the one true starter of the group, and I think he's by far the best player you can get on the open market, that at any given time could give you about quarterback 25 through quarterback 12 production. I don't think he's ever going to be an elite player. I just don't think he has the mental ability to do so, but he's still talented. He can throw the ball. He's a good deep passer. He's got pretty good ability to escape the rush and make plays. He's also pretty tough in the pocket and can fit a system like the Bucs or a system like the Saints, as we've seen in recent seasons, and be productive. So Jameis Winston is a player that is the one true starter here. Now, the rest of the group, Mitch Trubisky, I have at number 2. That's going to be something that you don't see very often with other analysts or other websites that are ranking these players. But I've always liked Mitchell Trubisky a little bit. From Chicago, I think he's always had talent. I think he was kind of unfairly criticized. I was never like, at a certain moment, you realize the guy just didn't have it as a true upper echelon player. But I think he was more productive than people want to give him credit for in Chicago, and I think he kind of got a bad rep there. And then on top of that, I feel like in Buffalo, he matured as a player and showed that in a better system that kind of suits his skills, he can actually be maybe a borderline starter or a guy that maybe one more chance you can give him. And that is why I put him at number 2, because he's still very young. I think he's in his mid-20s, and I believe that you could still potentially squeeze some potential out of him, especially like a place like, let's just say, the Giants, where you have Daniel Jones and maybe you want to go with him, but you've got Brian Daboll there, and maybe you want a guy that can push your starter. Mitchell Trubisky is that type of player, and I think that year in Buffalo really did help him. Marcus Mariota is another player similar to that. I think we've seen more of Marcus Mariota at this point to understand what he is, but I do think his time in Las Vegas or Oakland or whatever has helped him to develop into maybe more of a refined passer. I don't think he's ever going to be great in that department, but every time he fills in for Derek Carr, he does a solid job. He has legs to be able to move, and I view him more as like a potential bridge starter and a high-end backup type of player. Teddy Bridgewater is the same for me. I would probably be lesser on Teddy Bridgewater. He's been a big thing over the last couple of years for whatever reason, and you guys understand if you follow me for years. I've never been a big Teddy Bridgewater fan, but Teddy Bridgewater is a guy that can still play a few games a year. I don't think you want to be going into a season with Teddy Bridgewater as your starter. I would prefer to have him as a high-end backup for a pocket passer type player, so that when that player maybe gets hurt, he can fill in and he can be productive, but I wouldn't be willing to overpay him the way that teams have been doing so in the last couple of years. Tyrod Taylor, I think, was pretty good on a really bad team with the Texans this past season, has some mobility, is a pro, can help tutor a younger player, and that's all good and awesome. Andy Dalton at number 6, I think. I have him over Fitzpatrick. I mean, that's pretty close to me. They're very similar. They're older pocket passer players. Fitzpatrick got hurt, so that's really the reason I put him at 7 and not higher. But Andy Dalton showed some ability to still be able to throw the football and be accurate and be consistent in Chicago, but he got hurt a lot last year, and that's definitely a concern. So he's a backup and a guy like Tyrod who has experience starting, can fill in if he needs to, but he's not fantastic anymore. Ryan Fitzpatrick is a wild card player. You might be able to get away with him as a starter for like half your season, and he might be productive, but he's kind of thrives off being a backup and a guy that nobody sees coming, and that's often where he's at his best. I still think he's got decent mobility. He doesn't have much of an arm anymore, but he's smart. He'll get rid of the ball. He'll do a good job protecting your offensive line, and he can definitely execute an offense, any offense, because he's been in every single one of them. Cam Newton, I think, should be utilized as... This is tough because Cam Newton is such a big personality, and Cam Newton is such a big person off the field, and players really love him and respect him, and he's a great leader, but he's no longer a great quarterback, and you have to understand that if you sign him. So with Cam Newton, I think he would be great as a potential short yardage quarterback. I think he's kind of a glitch like that, and then also he'd be very good in the locker room, but he can't be a threat towards your starter or else it's not going to work. Number 9, Jacoby Brissett. I just wasn't impressed with what I saw from him in Miami. I thought he didn't look good at all. I used to like him quite a bit and thought he could start in the league, and he had his moment to shine, but he never really fulfilled that, so I think he's just a solid solid backup, I should say. And then Colt McCoy. Jacoby, like Cam, can also do some similar things, like in short yardage and stuff like that. He's also a smart player and a good guy, so that helps as a backup. Colt McCoy was actually really good as a backup last year for the Cardinals and showed that he could still play. So he's somebody that's actually filled in quite a bit over the years as a backup and can be good to go for any team. So he's kind of another guy that's a veteran, smart player, good locker room guy that can help you out. But those are the top 10 quarterbacks for sure. Now, when looking at the undervalued and the buyer bewares, we've got Mitch Trubisky as the undervalued centerpiece here. Like I said, I think Mitch Trubisky is a player that can Come in, and if you're smart about it, he still has some potential that you can squeeze and could potentially be a starter and a bridge guy to see the potential. See, this is the thing about having bridge players, right? I would rather have a bridge player that still maybe has a chance at being decent than having a bridge player that you know what he is. And that's what I'm trying to say here. So, like, Teddy Bridgewater, for example, we know what he is. We've seen enough of him to understand what he is. Mitch Trubisky, we still don't quite know if he can still maybe give us some sort of starting capability. So I'd rather gamble on that type of guy, who's still young, by the way, than a guy that we've seen enough of. Ryan Fitzpatrick could be undervalued because he's coming off a year where 2 years ago in Miami, he was really, really good. And then he got hurt in Washington, and we never saw him play. So he could potentially be very undervalued because he was set to be a starter last year. So that's why I put him under that category. Buyer beware, as I said, Teddy Bridgewater. I just feel like he's getting overpaid every single season. And then Cam Newton, because you don't want to bring him in a locker room where you have a young starter that's maybe not proven. Let's just say if you're Miami, you don't want to have Cam Newton as your backup because Tua has shown some promise, but he's also a guy that's been definitely heavily criticized as well. So that is a player that you don't want to overpay and you don't want to bring into a possible hostile situation because even though he's not as good as he used to be, Cam Newton is still a big name, and players will look at him and be like, he should start at quarterback, and that's going to cause an issue in your locker room. So that's the quarterback position and my thoughts on it. Now, if you guys have any questions about quarterback, let me know in the comments section below. It's a pretty straightforward group. Like I said, I think Jameis Winston's the only guy that's going to be able to start anywhere. Otherwise, it's going to be a couple bridge starters potentially, or guys competing for jobs, and then a bunch of backups. And I'm going to be most intrigued to see the contracts that some of these guys get in terms of how much money, because I think we're going to see a lot of different strategy this year at the quarterback position because there's so many guys available for trade or potentially available for trade. And then on top of that, there are really not a lot of players in the draft that you look at and say they can be a franchise quarterback. So teams might be willing to overpay some of these guys, and teams might be willing to potentially overpay for a trade because it's not a great free agency crop as well. Where do I see Mitch ending up? I have him going to Tennessee. I think the most sense is in New York with the Giants because, like I said, I think Brian Daboll was with Mitch Trubisky last year. From what I saw in preseason, as well as a little bit in the regular season, I thought Trubisky performed quite well for the Bills in that system. And I think Daniel Jones is a quarterback that we don't know exactly if he's going to be the long-term solution. So give him a guy that was a former first-round pick. Try to motivate him that way. On top of that, you have a player that can step in when Daniel Jones eventually gets hurt, because that's happened year after year after year. And he already knows the offense, and he has some talent. So it's not like you're going to be too far off from what you have in Daniel Jones. So the Giants, to me, is the best spot for Mitch Trubisky. All right, let's get to the running back position. Free agent running backs this year. We have a pretty good group, I would say, of running backs. I think that there's a couple to be aware of. There's definitely some guys with some age and tread on the tires. You've got Leonard Fournette, Cordell Patterson, Raheem Mostert, who's very interesting, James Conner, guys like that, Melvin Gordon, those type of names. You also have quite a few receiving running backs like James White, who's a free agent, Jerick McKinnon, who's a free agent, J.D. McKissick, Gio Bernard, Duke Johnson, David Johnson maybe even. These guys that can maybe play a third down role and a scat back type of role. And then there are certainly some that could be risky if you sign them to big contracts. Like James Conner had a really good year last year. Cordell Patterson had a really good year last year. But I'm not sure they're long-term solutions at this position, and I'm not sure right now the NFL is willing to pay for these type of players in free agency because they understand the running back is probably not as valuable as they thought it was in the past. So let's get to the running back lists. Starting off with the top 10 running backs this free agency, we've got Leonard Fournette. At number 1, I think just in terms of a 3-down skill set and how productive he was with the Bucs, I think Leonard Fournette is your best bet for a workhorse type of player. Cordell Patterson probably isn't a workhorse, but he's a wide receiver / running back / returner / hybrid playmaker that can do some damage if you use him correctly. So there's a big asterisk next to his name. Raheem Mostert's coming off multiple injuries, but you can't teach his speed. He has Olympic speed, and if he's healthy, he can be a difference maker in a limited role. I would say if you could give Mostert 8 to 12 carries a game in the Shanahan-esque offense, he would be very productive. So that's why I have him at number 3. James Conner was really good for the Cardinals last year as a 3-down back. He can pass protect, he can catch the football, he can run routes, he can run the ball in between the tackles. He's pretty good everywhere. He doesn't have explosive speed or explosive difference-making ability, but I think in a rotation, or even going cheap on the position and maybe pairing him with a younger back might not be a bad idea. I am a huge fan of Chase Edmonds. I think Chase Edmonds is my personal favorite guy in this group in terms of who I would look to sign. If I was looking for a guy that could catch the football and be a difference maker in the passing game for a pass-first offense, I'd be looking at Chase Edmonds. You can split him out wide. You can play him in the slot. You can put him in the backfield. He can run the ball a little bit, and he could be productive in the modern NFL in the pass-first offenses in this league. Rashad Penny is really, really interesting because he was really good at the end of this past season, and you know that he's been a first-round pick, but the big thing with him is that he's been, hurt a lot. So he has a lot of potential as a guy that's probably a 2-down player, but is really explosive and still has a lot, probably, of years left in the NFL. So he's maybe like a 1-year prove-it deal that could be really, really worth it. Melvin Gordon is just a well-rounded player that can still play. A lot of people think he stinks, but if you really watch the Broncos this year, he's a good player. He can catch the ball, he can pass protect, he can run the ball still, and he's still got pretty good speed. So Melvin Gordon is somebody that if I was a contender and I was maybe needing a little bit more at running back, I'd sign Melvin Gordon to a 1-year contract and look for him to be at least in the rotation of my running backs that can kind of play in any role that you need him to play. Ronald Jones has been a personal favorite of mine over the past 3 years. Very, very good runner, but nothing else is he going to give you. He's not going to give you a receiver. He's not going to give you a pass protector, and you can tell that the Bucs didn't trust him in those situations. But if you need a guy on early downs to run the ball, he's explosive, he is powerful, and he would be a really good first down, second down player. Jerick McKinnon showed some promise at the end of the year with the Chiefs. Can do a little bit of everything, but is kind of more of a scat back and is pretty elusive still and is a very good athlete and can catch the ball. And then Duke Johnson is my number 10, man. Duke Johnson looked really good with the Dolphins at the end of the year. I was highly questioning why he wasn't signed earlier in the offseason, but he has a skill set to do a little bit of everything. I like him more as a receiver than I do a runner, but he is somebody that I'd look to maybe sign like the Dolphins did if I needed help at the running back position. There's guys like James White and stuff, as I brought up, that are also free agents. James White, he's older. He's coming off like a torn ACL or whatever. And, I don't know how good he's going to, or how explosive he's going to be. He's very smart and he's a very good receiver. I just don't know if his years have passed. The same thing could be said about Gio Bernard. Justin Jackson is probably like a third running back at this point. J.D. McKissick is a third down back, and David Johnson I would treat as a third down back at this point in his career as well. So that's the top 10. Now we look at the undervalued and the buyer beware running backs. So I've got Chase Edmonds as my undervalued player because I think he's very young still. He's like entering his prime. And I think in this modern NFL, he's the type of player that you want to sign. Jerick McKinnon, I think, is probably going to go for very cheap, but he still showed me a flash of bursts that I liked from him in Kansas City. So I'd still be willing to roll the dice on a 1-year deal with him as well. My buyer bewares are Cordell Patterson and Raheem Mostert. And the reason for that is I look at Patterson as a player that you need to know how you're going to use him. He's also a little bit older, so I'm not sure like how drastically his game might drop off, because a lot of his game is after, contact and the ability to fight through contact and make people miss. Raheem Mostert, just all the injuries and the injuries that come through the season. So I wouldn't be willing to pay neither of those guys big money to play running back. But if you could get them on some sort of deal, then I'd definitely be willing to do that. Now, the case with Cordell Patterson is buyer beware, because I don't think he's going to be coming for a cheap contract because of how good he was last year. And it was by far his most productive year in the NFL. So that's why it's really, really tough for me to buy into him at that running back position. The wide receiver position. The position that everybody looks forward to every free agency, it feels like, because there's always a good crop of wide receivers to sign. There's a bunch of different type of receivers. There's the go up and get it red zone targets. There's the shifty underneath playmakers after the catch. There's the deep threats. There's the route runners. There's the possession players. And this free agency has all of those type of players once again. I did not include Sony Michel in my running back rankings, guys. Nitty, I did not include him. I don't think he deserves to be in the top 10. I think he's in that next crop of guys. But I would look at him as, a number 2 or number 3 running back on your depth chart for sure. The wide receiver position. Now let's take a look at the top 10 wide receivers. As I stated, a lot of different type of players that you can look to sign. And that's why it's going to be interesting to see where these guys go. So the wide receiver top 10. Let's begin with Davante Adams. So Davante Adams is most likely going to reset the market in terms of the wide receiver position. He might even make up to $30 million a season, but he's probably worth it because he's arguably the best receiver in the NFL. He is a one-man wide receiving core in Green Bay. And whenever a receiver can be that productive despite being the lone target in an offense that really demands respect, that means he's really good. So Davante Adams is number 1. I'm not sure he's going to make it out of Green Bay with any sort of, he's going to have that franchise tag. He's probably going to stay in Green Bay. But if he makes it to the market, it would be very intriguing to see how many teams would be worthy of getting his services. And then number 2 is Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin's an awesome player. He's also probably a top 10 receiver in the NFL. He can serve as a slot receiver or a perimeter receiver. He's excellent after the catch. He's very tough. He's still very young, too. I think he's like 26 or 27. He's super young. He's in his prime, and I wouldn't even worry about his injury because he's really good. I think he might end up leaving the Bucs because Tom Brady has departed, but we'll see. Mike Williams, I think I've said this before. I think he's slightly overrated, but I put him at number 3 because of his age. He's very young, and he's hitting the market at a prime age, so there's a lot of years of production. A lot of the times when teams sign wide receivers, they sign them too late. They sign them past their prime, and that can become the major problem. But with Mike Williams, he's very largely injury-free, and he's very young, and you know what he is. He's a red zone extraordinaire. He's a jump ball player. He's not going to create a lot of separation, and that's why I'm not super high on him. But if you have a quarterback that needs a jump ball, go and get it type of receiver, and probably a upper echelon number 2, then Mike Williams is your answer. He can thrive versus one-on-ones, and I thought he had his best season of his career this past year with Justin Herbert and the Chargers. My number 4 is Odell Beckham Jr. He would be number 3, but he tore his ACL. Odell was really good with the Rams and proved me right when I said that he was still a really good player. Is he the player he was with the Giants? No, that's a Hall of Fame talent. He's still really good though, and I still think he's worthy of being a number 1 receiver on a lower end depth chart, but he's probably a really good number 2. As he showed you with the Rams, in that Super Bowl, they dropped off dramatically in that Super Bowl production-wise at that position when Odell left the game. He's still that great complement. If he gets a lot of one-on-ones like he did with the Rams, he's going to make you pay as a route runner. He's still explosive down the field and can beat you deep. He's still really good. He's a great hands catcher. He can go up and get it. For his size, he's still really good. The only area I think Odell has regressed is his after the catch ability, where he used to be dynamic, and that's potentially where that ACL injury is going to hurt him. Now, what I will say about Odell is that he's probably not going to be healthy until like midway next year. So I think if you're a contender, you're more than likely going to sign him. I think he probably wants to stay in LA, but I think another team, like let's say the Packers, if they get Aaron Rodgers back, or if, the Chiefs are looking for a player, or an upper echelon team that Odell knows has a solid foundation and a quarterback, he probably would be willing to go there as well. Allen Robinson at number 5, I think is the most intriguing player here, because I think Allen Robinson is a player that had his worst year at the wrong time. So Allen Robinson had a really bad year this past season, production-wise. He didn't put up a lot of yards, touchdowns, catches, all that stuff, and he just kind of generally struggled to make plays. But I still think he's really good, and I still think that he can be a very good number 2 receiver. I don't think I'd want him to be my number 1, but if you brought him into a stable of receivers, or let's say you were the Chiefs and you needed a nice number 2 for Mahomes and a guy that's dramatically different from Tyreek Hill, that is the type of player that I would want to get. A route runner who is Allen Robinson, who can play inside, outside. He's got a good frame. He can go up and get it. He makes spectacular grabs. And I think he's a player that would really thrive as a number 2 receiver at this point in his career. He maybe dropped a little bit this year in terms of just his ability, but I think he would thrive opposite of a number 1 wide receiver for potentially cheaper than I think people would realize. So he might be a bargain this offseason. Michael Gallup is a player that I've always liked as a vertical player, and I think that he still has some burst and some speed, and he's a more crafty route runner than given credit for. I thought Dak Prescott's ability and just overall production dropped when Michael Gallup wasn't playing, because I think he gives them that solid option on the outside that can win one-on-one. So Michael Gallup is my number 6. Number 7, DJ Chark is one of the more intriguing options at this position, because he has super high-end ability, a great speed. If you need a deep threat and a guy that can burn a defense, I think DJ Chark showed that ability in spurts throughout his career. And with Trevor Lawrence last year, he really started to show a connection, but just got hurt at the wrong time. So DJ Chark is that type of player that, a team like the Packers should be looking at, or a team that needs that vertical player. Even a team like my Patriots should maybe be looking at a DJ Chark who could play on the outside and make a defense pay for maybe putting too many people in the box versus the run. Number 8, Juju Smith-Schuster. I still think can be a very good player, but he's not a number 1 receiver and never was. I think he'd be a solid slot player that actually still has some potential in him. And that's the thing with Juju, is I think he's been so heavily scrutinized, and a lot of people don't like his actions off the field with all the dancing and the showboat and the TikTok stuff. But if you can get past that, you can see a really productive young player that maybe you can get at the right time for a cheap contract on a prove-it deal. And he's tough. He can block well. He's not super explosive, but he's a solid route runner. And I think he would be a very good number 2 wide receiver. Christian Kirk is kind of inconsistent, but he shows a little bit of everything. Slot ability, downfield ability, yards after catch ability. Christian Kirk has shown all of that throughout his career. It's just a little bit inconsistent. But I would really love him as a number 3 or, a lower end number 2 receiver. Will Fuller, the only reason he's at number 10 is we know his injuries. He's much better than Christian Kirk, in my opinion, but he's just always hurt. So he always has something wrong with him. But if you can get the right season of Will Fuller on a 1-year contract, it's certainly worth the gamble, because he's a difference maker when he does play. So Will Fuller is still pretty good. And then we've got the undervalued and the buyer bewares. So Braxton Berrios is a player that's also a free agent who is not in my top 10. I think is an extremely undervalued player. Every time I watch the Jets, he makes plays. He has gotten better as a player every year. He was drafted by my Patriots and then cut, and then he found a role on the Jets as a slot receiver. He's got really good explosive breakaway ability for a shorter slot white dude. And I think that's pretty good. He's also an excellent returner. He's Pro Bowl level punt returner. And every time he's filled in as a player, I think he's been productive. So if you're looking for a slot receiver for maybe cheaper value that maybe has some upside, Braxton Berrios could be the answer there. DJ Chark, like I said, I think still has a ton of potential and has never really been able to showcase it because he's been in Jacksonville. My buyer beware, Will Fuller, of course, I couldn't go without it. And then Mike Williams as well, because Mike Williams, I think, is not worth a number one wide receiver contract. And that is why I think he's a buyer beware, because I think he might be getting that on the open market. And I just don't know if I'd be willing to do so with a player that just doesn't separate at the rate that I need to see from an upper echelon player. So those are my buyer beware and undervalued players at the wide receiver position. Okay, so that's the wide receiver position. If you guys have any questions, let me know. That's a position with tons of players, and I even have players that I didn't even mention. So, continuing with the wide receiver position, Antonio Brown is a free agent. Obviously, he'd be in my top 10. I didn't include him in my top 10 because, quite frankly, he's an idiot. So I didn't put him in my top 10. And he's an awesome player, and I've always liked the guy as a player, but it's really hard to rely on him. So if you're going to bring him in, you almost need to treat him as a luxury and not a need. So Antonio Brown's not going to get anything more than a 1-year contract. He didn't go in my top 10. But really, really, really good player that will probably end up on a contending team, most likely, if he's going to play again. Other players that I didn't include, Marquise Valdes-Scantling is like a designated deep threat, can stretch a defense, can make plays. I think he's always been pretty good and has been a solid number 2 to Devontae Adams, opening up space from the underneath areas of the field because of his speed. Isaiah McKenzie torched my Patriots multiple times this year. Is a really good player with the ball in his hands. I think he was really low on a crowded depth chart. He was behind Stephon Diggs, Gabriel Davis, Cole Beasley, Emmanuel Sanders. But I think if he goes to a team on a cheap contract where he could play as the number 3, I think he could add speed and he could add quickness and he could add maybe a slot receiver for a team. Jamison Crowder, I still think has ability on a potential team that needs a slot player or just a productive veteran player as a number 3 or number 4, he can still be good. T.Y. Hilton can be a nice number 3 option in the receiving game as a perimeter player. Doesn't quite have the deep threat ability still, but is more of a refined receiver than he gets credit for. Russell Gage is pretty underrated as well and is a decent number 2 and a really good number 3 receiver for a team. Cedric Wilson, I was impressed by. Has a little bit of physicality and speed from Dallas. Pretty good. Emmanuel Sanders is old, but still decent as like a number 3 or number 4. Just don't overpay him. AJ Green, same thing. If you want an occasional guy that's going to make a big play or a guy for the red zone, AJ Green could be a guy. Just don't expect him to be a number 2 at this point. Sammy Watkins, same thing. And Laquan Treadwell actually had a really productive end of his season in Jacksonville. Could be maybe a steal for a team looking for a high upside option. That was a former first-round pick that maybe is just coming into his own now, that maybe you could steal for a 1-year prove-it deal type of contract and see if he can add some sort of something to your receiving core. So there's so many wide receiver options out there for your team to add. And I'm hoping that my Patriots add a few. That's for sure. So that's the wide receiver position. The tight end position. Let's get to tight ends. I think the tight end position actually really, really good this year. I think there's some really interesting players, and there's at least 3 top 10 tight ends on the market. About top 10 options on the market. And there are some older guys that certainly can still be productive. There's some younger guys that maybe has never truly broken out quite yet. There's some injured guys that are coming back that could be pretty good. So the tight end position, I feel, is a position in free agency right now that can have a lot of value because nobody's really dishing out huge contracts to tight ends, and typically lower end contracts than, let's just say, like the wide receiver position. So the tight end position is maybe a value for a lot of teams. So, tight ends. Top 10. Let's start off with Mike Gesicki, who is from the Miami Dolphins, of course. Really, really good player. Honestly, more of a big slot receiver than anything else. I feel like he is underrated across the NFL, but he's not going to provide blocking for you or an inline tight end. He's like a big slot receiver, but he's really good at it. He can win jump balls. He can run routes really well. I think he is deceptive in how quick he is for such a tall, big-bodied guy. I would be looking to sign him. If I need a number 2 option in my receiving game, I would probably rather sign him than somebody like Mike Williams. Dalton Schultz is younger than Gronk, so that's why I put him at number 2, but just a really productive possession player. He's probably better as a number 3 target in your offense than a number 2, but he's still really, really deceptively good and is just super smart. Good after the catch. They involve him in the screen game as well, and just finds the holes in the zone and had really good rapport with Dak Prescott. I think with a veteran quarterback that needs like a reliable chain mover, I think Dalton Schultz is your guy. Rob Gronkowski. Gronk, I put him at number 3 as well. He's better than Dalton Schultz in my opinion, but Gronk is like, he's probably only going to play one more year, and that's kind of the trouble with Gronk is like, how long are you willing to sign him for? He also probably has a really short like list of teams that he actually wants to play for, so that's also something with Gronk, but what you're getting with Gronk, and I thought he was better last year than he was the year before, but what you're getting with him is still a really, really good tight end who can do everything really well. He can still block at an elite level. He can run still at a deceptively good level. He can separate. He can win jump balls. And I think he's still a good number 2 option in a receiving game. He's probably way better as a number 3. Like we saw with the Bucs, he was really productive when Godwin and Evans were on the field. But as a number 2, he still showed that he could put up like 60 to 80 yards a game, and that's pretty darn good for a tight end. He's also amazing in the red zone and just generally a really smart player that can do everything, split out wide, play in the slot, play in line. So I think he's going to play one more year and probably play for a contender. If Brady comes back, then he'll probably play with Brady. But if Brady doesn't decide to come back, he'll probably be willing to go to a team with a good quarterback that has a chance to win. CJ Uzomah showed his promise throughout the playoffs and the regular season with the Bengals. Just a nice complementary option to a offense. Has pretty athletic ability, in terms of after the catch, in terms of screens. He did a lot of that with Cincinnati. Not a great blocker, but a pretty good route runner and can make some plays in clutch situations. Zach Ertz actually was way better this year than I thought he would be. And he's kind of like the ageless wonder at this point, can be a nice number 3 option for an offense and can still make plays. He's just really savvy. Number 6, Robert Tonyan, who's coming off an injury but could be higher on this list based on his age and based on his recent production. Really good red zone threat. I do wonder how much of his success was just the Packers, but I do think he is deceptively good at running routes and definitely has really good hands. And Rodgers trusted him, so as a red zone threat and as a number 3 option in an offense, I think he could be pretty good. David Njoku is a personal favorite on this list for me because I think he still has a lot of production left in him. I think he still has a lot of potential left in him. He's very athletic, very good after the catch, can do a little bit of blocking, and I thought that he was the most productive tight end for the Browns last year, and he can make big splash plays, which I like about him. Evan Ingram, you can't be fooled by his production in the offense. I think he's been spam targeted a lot of years, but he's still like a big slot receiver. He's not going to block. But if you want, I think he'd be a solid number 3 or 4 option, and you put him in the slot and you kind of have a different look. And maybe his athleticism has been a little bit mistreated and misused in New York. So maybe you're gambling on that as well. Tyler Conklin filled in really well for Irv Smith in Minnesota, and I think is underrated. And Gerald Everett is very athletic, but just hasn't been super productive throughout his NFL career. So those are the top 10 tight ends. Now, in terms of the undervalued and the buyer beware, You've got David Njoku and Tyler Conklin as the undervalued players. I think Tyler Conklin could honestly be the guy where he gets like a 1 or 2 year contract and is super productive on the team. Like every time I saw him in Minnesota, I thought he showed pretty good speed. There's honestly not much separating like a Tyler Higbee and a Tyler Conklin in my opinion. They actually even look similar, but they've got very similar traits. After the catch, just ability to go outside and win vertically as well as win inside. Not fantastic blocking wise, but a decent receiving option. And then Njoku, I think, offers a really good balance of like, he's still pretty young. He's very athletic. He can block. And I think that's the guy where you're gambling on with a lot of upside. Buyer beware, OJ Howard was terrible this year in Tampa Bay. Like really bad. Maybe he's better coming off the injury. I think he's a buyer beware because a lot of people are going to look at his name and think he's better than he is. And the same thing can be said about Evan Ingram. I think he's just very one-dimensional. And in that one dimension, he's not super productive. So those are things that scare me about Evan Ingram. And that is the tight end position for 2022 NFL free agency. So let me know if you have any questions about the tight end position. But tight end is interesting for sure. Now let's move to the offensive line. The offensive line, the tackle position is the position that everybody looks for, the marquee signings, the big money signings. A lot of the big money on the offensive line goes towards the tackle position. I would say there's 4 or 5 really good tackles in the free agency crop. And then after like the top 4, it drops off significantly and then becomes a big cluster, you know what, of a bunch of players that are pretty good, maybe capable starters or swing tackles or maybe diamonds in the rough, but you kind of got to be able to sort through it and find the guy that you like the most for your team. So the tackle position. The top 10 tackles in free agency. Let's start off with the Saints' Teron Armstead, who's by far the best tackle in this free agency class. What's so interesting about him is oftentimes we don't see tackles hit the open market that are as good as him. So will he hit the open market is the question. He could, because the Saints are in a little bit of a transition period where Sean Payton's retired. They don't have a quarterback. So Teron Armstead might look to go to a team that needs to upgrade their offensive line. Cincinnati, that might be your guy right there. If you can dish out some money for that tackle position, Teron Armstead might be your guy. Or a team that has a young quarterback that needs a blindside tackle, I would not be shocked if Armstead got $20 million a year. He's probably worth it too. Number 2 is Trent Brown. Trent Brown of the Patriots. The only issue with Trent Brown is, 1, his motivation levels. You've got to have him in a place that he believes in. And then number 2, his injury history is definitely lengthy. But when he plays, he is very good, especially as a run blocker where he can be a big mauler and a physical presence. So Trent Brown could play the left or the right side and be very good, which is a bonus. He's also still fairly young. I think he's like 27. So he's still in that market and that range where he could make a lot of money. But I think that a lot of teams have seen his production in places not named New England and will say maybe he's too risky for us. So he might just be back in New England because of that. But very, very good player when he is motivated and when he is healthy. Number 3 is Orlando Brown, which is maybe lower than other people have him. I was not impressed by Orlando Brown this year a lot of the time when I saw him play with the Chiefs. I thought he got beat a lot by like speed rushers and finesse rushers. I think he's kind of similar to Trent Brown. Like they're both really big and kind of slow, but they're both monsters, and when they're motivated and they're playing well, they're really good. It's just keeping that consistency. Orlando Brown is very young, though, so that is a huge upside. And the one thing I will say about Orlando Brown is if you're a team with a young quarterback, you could pair Orlando Brown with them or with that quarterback for many years to come because he is only like 25. So you could have a starting left tackle, even if he's not elite, for about 10 years, which might be worth the money. At number 4, Dwayne Brown of the Seahawks. Really good player and honestly maybe underrated. So if you're a contending team that needs to upgrade tackle, Dwayne Brown is your guy because he probably only has 2 years left, maybe 3, but he's going to be really good during those seasons, kind of like Andrew Whitworth was at the end of his career. Number 5, Moses, I thought is just generally underrated all the time, but his only real issue is health. He's still not too old and can be a solid starting tackle for you, which is definitely worth signing. Eric Fisher is similar. I think he has more age concern than Moses, but if you're looking for a solid, capable left tackle, that's your guy. Riley Reif, he actually played pretty well for the Bengals until he got hurt and is a good swing tackle and probably a really good third tackle, but he'll probably end up being a starter somewhere for like a 1-year deal. Cornelius Lucas, really underrated, I think is a top swing tackle in the league, and whenever he fills in, has been productive and has graded very well. Afedi is a good pass blocker, not so good of a run blocker, but he can have some upside still. And then Brandon Shell is probably more of a third tackle option, but he actually played some of his best football this past season with Seattle. So at number 10, Brandon Shell. All right, so that's the tackle position. Now my undervalued and my buyer beware players. So at the undervalued, I got Cornelius Lucas because, like I said, every year he plays well when he fills in as a starter, but he's never really been given the opportunity to be a starter. So he might have his shine now and be willing for a team to give him a contract as a starter instead of just a swing tackle. And I do have Dwayne Brown as undervalued because I think everybody's going to look at like Trent Brown, Orlando Brown, and Armstead and be like, oh, those players are the cream of the crop. But you might be able to sneak in Dwayne Brown for like a 1-year deal where you can get a top tackle for 1 season, which is very valuable. Buyer beware, Trent Brown and Orlando Brown, just because of, like I said, they've got weight issues, they've got motivation issues, and I just feel like you might overpay them. If you're not the right team for them, it might not work. So that's the way that I view tackles. Now, there are a lot of players that are still not, I didn't even mention at the tackle position. So we're looking at guys like Bobby Massey, Cam Robinson, Dennis Kelly, Tom Compton, Jason Peters even. There's still a lot of guys that I didn't put in my top 10 or on my undervalued / buyer beware lists that are probably going to start or be upper echelon backups. So look out for those guys as well. Looking at that type of list, all those guys are... Dennis Kelly is more of a swing tackle. Tom Compton filled in well for Mike McGlinchey in San Francisco. Bob Massey is probably a swing tackle as well, or a backup. And then Cam Robinson probably has the most potential. He got better this year, but still is not very good. So that's the tackle position. Now let's move to guard, which guard I think has less big names this season than maybe even last year. Last year, like Joe Tooney got the most money at the guard position in the history of free agency from the Chiefs. They wanted to fix that problem. They did. But guard is often a position where you can find a lot of undervalued free agents and a lot of guys that, like 20 players at this position where they could be starters this year. And this is the diamond in the rough territory. For teams that need to fix their offensive lines, they should be targeting multiple guards from this crop of free agency. So let's begin with the top 10. So Brandon Scherff is by far the best. He's a borderline all-pro type of player, and I'm not sure if he's going to leave Washington, but he could. He possibly could. He's very, very good, all facets of the game, and if you are one offensive lineman away, you might be willing to give him a big contract. James Daniels is very young. I think worthy of a pretty big contract because of his age and his potential, and he's been very productive every season of his career. He's also, I believe, played a little bit of center in Chicago. Tomlinson is about 30 years old now, but he's been very good since becoming a Niner, which I think is interesting. So there might be a little bit of risk if he leaves that system, but if you're in that same tree, say you're the Rams, you're the Jets, you're the Niners, you're the, who else? the Vikings, teams like that maybe looking for a guy like Tomlinson, he's going to be very good in that system. He's not elite, but he's very good. Alex Kappa is young. I believe he's about 26 or 27. He's physical. He's a good run blocker, pretty powerful guy, and you could probably get as a diamond in the rough type signing. I think he's just as good as a guy like Connor Williams, but doesn't have as high of a profile, so that maybe he's a steal. Connor Williams is somebody that I think has graded well, but every time I kind of watch the Cowboys, I feel like teams kind of pick on him as an interior pass blocker. I think he's a better run blocker, I should say, than pass blocker, where I do think he can be beat. But he's young, and he can certainly get better, and I think with the right pieces around him, he's going to be a really productive player. Andrew Norwell is really interesting because he used to be elite, and he went to Jacksonville, and he's kind of declined every year, but he's not that old, and I think on the right team, he could return to really good form, so he might be undervalued a little bit. Austin Corbett, I think, is kind of a little bit risky because I think he's good, but again, he's a type of player that needs to be in the right fit and the right scheme, and I would worry if he wasn't in that Rams system. That is kind of like my thing with him. I think he's good, but in the right system. Mark Glowinski is solid, but how much did he benefit from the other pieces in Indianapolis? That is a major question, but he's a solid, capable guard. Ted Karras, I think, is very underrated, is really good as a guy that can fill in as a guard or a center, and actually started the majority of the season for New England at a pretty high level, so he could play center or guard and start at either position. He's a veteran, he's well-rounded, and probably a better run blocker than pass blocker, but still a good player. Quinton Spain, I know that heavily criticized from Cincinnati, but starting capable guard, probably on the lower end, but still starting nonetheless. All right. So those are the guards. Now the undervalued and the buyer beware. So the undervalued, like I said, Ted Karras. He's just a player that I would sign for like a 2-year deal, and I know I would have a guard or a center starter for sure. He's not going to be elite, but he's going to be very solid at either spot. Andrew Norwell, as I said, maybe some teams are scared off of his recent production in terms of his production have slid a little bit year after year, but I just wonder how much of that is playing in Jacksonville, because I do think he's still really good as a pass blocker, and if you can get him, like kind of like Kevin Zeitler, for example, right? Kevin Zeitler went to the Ravens and then automatically got better as a result. Like people thought he was sliding in New York, and I could view Andrew Norwell as the next Kevin Zeitler in that regard. Buyer beware, as I said, Austin Corbett and Connor Williams, I think are in high-profile teams with good offensive lines, but I'm not sure how good they are individually if you were to place them in other systems on other teams. So those are the guys that I'm a little bit buyer beware that I wouldn't be willing to give big-time money. What's up, everybody? Nice to see Arthur in the chat. What's going on, man? Thanks for joining. Okay. Center position. The centers. There's one extremely good center. His name is Ryan Jensen of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Other than that, there's probably some capable starters and some high-end backup type centers, but not a ton of guys that you're going to be going out and paying a ton of money this season at the center position. I thought last year's crop was actually pretty darn good. This year, not as much. So let's get to the top 10 centers of free agency. So top 10 centers of free agency. Ryan Jensen, like I said, the best of the group. I think he's an elite center. He's not that old quite yet. And the thing I think makes Ryan Jensen such a great signing is that I believe Ryan Jensen is the type of offensive lineman that would be really good on any team. If you were to put him in a zone system, I think it would work. If you were to put him in a power system, I think it would work. If you were to just put him in any team, from Jacksonville to Tampa Bay, it would work, and that's why he's worth the money to me. He's also very physical. The only thing I will say about Ryan Jensen is he's a bit, if you want to get some chippiness to your offensive line, he might be your guy, But he is kind of bad at snapping sometimes. I don't know why, but he does have some inconsistencies in that regard. But if you're able to get over that, he's an amazing player. Ben Jones of the Titans is really, really good and has been really, really good for like 6 years and nobody knows who he is. But he's a Titans center and is more so obviously suited for the Titans style of play, which is more power ball. But he's going to be a top 10 to 12 center for probably the next 3 to 4 seasons. And that's probably a really solid signing. And you probably won't have to give nearly as much money as you would to Ryan Jensen. Bradley Bozeman is a power center. He played guard a lot for the Ravens, but he moved to center this year and was a better player at that position. So I think he would be a nice value because I think you're probably getting him for cheaper just because he has less experience at that spot, but he has shown that he's good at that spot. Brian Allen of the Rams, another player that I'm a little bit skeptical of from the Rams. I'm just skeptical of the Rams offensive linemen individually because it seems like when they leave that team, they're not as good. So that is kind of my worry with them, but you saw like him and Austin Blythe, for example. So both of these guys have started for the Rams in recent seasons, and they've both been very, very good at different moments. And Austin Blythe left to the Chiefs, and he filled in as a backup, but he wasn't a starter there. And both of them have graded really well, but neither of them I feel like are elite individual talents. So I'd be more willing to go for like a guy like Austin Blythe, and we'll talk about that in a second. Matt Paredes. Matt Paredes is really still good. I wouldn't say he's elite anymore or even close to that level, but you probably won't have to dish out the type of cash that you did the last time that he was a free agent, and it might be worth it just to get a solid, capable starter who was on a really bad offensive line and might be better off now on a different team. And the only other issue with him is injuries. He's had a lot of them in recent seasons. Ethan Pocic is pretty good, physical player, younger, I think, still. So, worth the gamble. He's still a starting capable center. He's about top 20. Justin Britt is around the same. I believe both of them played in Seattle at one point. Austin Blythe, like I just brought up, former Ram, last year was a Chief, can play center, can play a little bit of guard, but mostly a center, and is a zone system fit. Lucas Patrick wasn't very good with the Packers this year, but he can fill in as a backup. And Tyler Shatley for the Jacksonville Jags played okay, but yeah, nothing special there. So those are the centers, top 10 centers in the NFL free agency this year. In terms of the undervalued and the buyer beware, Evan Brown is an undervalued player from the Lions who filled in for Frank Ragnow and played pretty darn well. So Evan Brown is somebody to look out for. Could be a diamond in the rough who could he's probably going to leave Detroit just because he's probably going to get better money somewhere else, but I do think he's definitely a starting capable player. Austin Blythe, as I said, would be a really good, I think a great fit for a zone system and probably going to be way less money than Brian Allen. So that's why I have them on both opposite sides, because Blythe just happened to leave that team this year and Brian Allen took his spot, who was his backup before, and they kind of both have had the same production. I think Allen's more likely to get more money than Blythe is. And Paredes, buyer beware just because of his age and his injury history. That's how I see the center position. So that is the offense, guys. Those are the offensive players for offensive free agents in 2022. We will get to the defense. If you have any questions, though, hit me up right now about offense before I slide to the defensive side of the football. Nicholas says, Mitch, it feels like it was not long ago when you did this video for last year. This year flew by. Yeah, maybe a little bit. I don't know. It feels like it was a while for me. I could be wrong. I think I am doing this video a lot earlier than I did last year, just because I was so busy with school at that time. What's up, ECK? How you doing? Lenny, what up, Lenny B? How you doing, my man? Sterling says, sup, Mitch? What's going on, Sterling? Nice to see you, man. Arthur says, Mitch, since you're an honorary Lions fan, you need to tell everybody we need Michael Gallup or DJ Chark. All right, the Lions need Michael Gallup or DJ Chark. But in my opinion, if they could get any of those top receivers, that would be great. And honestly, the Lions should be looking to stock up at wide receiver. Probably one, free agent, maybe two, maybe one high end, one low end, and then going for the draft as well. They definitely need to load up at that position. Isaac says Miami needs to steal a top 3 offensive line and a good running back, unless they draft a running back. I could see them drafting a running back, but I don't think it's ever a bad... They still have Myles Gaskin, right? So I don't think it's ever a bad idea to also get a veteran as well. I always look at it, if you have a position in need, attack it, attack it, attack it, attack it. Don't just stop with one addition, even 2 sometimes. The best way to cover and make sure you've got a position down is just continuously attacking it. Putting assets toward it. A bunch. Who do I think is going to get the biggest deal? I would say it's Devontae Adams. All right, let's move to the defensive side of the football. On defense, we are going to begin with the interior defensive line. What's up, Afix? How you doing, brother? All right. The free agent interior defensive lineman. And this position I don't think is as strong as it was a year ago. This is a position that I think has a ton of depth, but not a lot of upper echelon names. So if you're a team that needs a stud interior defensive lineman, you're more likely to find it in the draft than you are here. But there are some really quality role players, maybe that are a little bit older, but can still perform at a pretty high level. So let's take a look at the top 10 interior defensive linemen. So we start off with Akeem Hicks. Akeem Hicks of the Chicago Bears is the one guy that I will say he can definitely be elite. He is getting a little bit older in age, and he has dealt with some injuries, but when he has played for Chicago, he's been a difference maker in the run and the pass game, and can be an interior force. So Akeem Hicks, if I was a team that really needed a interior defensive lineman difference maker, and I was really close to being like a contending team, like let's just throw out a team, the Chargers, I would look to sign Akeem Hicks. Especially if you're that team that plays a lot of like 3-man interior lines like Chicago did, and you need a guy that he's kind of proven to play in both systems with the Saints and the Patriots and the Bears. He's been good in all areas and all teams, but I feel like specifically what Chicago did with him, it was a sign of what he can do very, very well. He's not really a nose tackle. He's more of like a interior, I guess you would call it like a 3-4 type end type of player, if you wanted to designate it that way. Calais Campbell is a little bit of everything. He's probably a Hall of Famer at the end of the day, but he's not quite the player he used to be in his prime, but he's still very good. He's especially really good as a run defender. I wouldn't be looking to pay him a ton of money long term as he's pretty old now, but a 2-year deal worth a decent chunk of change for a good team that needs a big force in the middle that can occasionally play on the edge. He can do a little bit of everything. He's massive. He's still very powerful. He's got long arms, can make plays as a pass rusher or a run defender. He's still really, really good. So those are the top 2 guys. BJ Hill, I think, is underrated. I thought he played really well for Cincinnati in the playoffs. He's primarily a run defender, but also can give you a presence as a pass rusher. And like I said, he's still young. So he's about 25, 26, I think. Big dude. And was productive both with the Giants and the Bengals. And they're 2 totally different type of schemes. So he's kind of proven that he can be good anywhere. DJ Jones is one of the most underrated players in free agency, I think. For the San Francisco 49ers, he was a force this year. I thought every time I watched the Niners, the guy was making plays in the run game and the pass game. I think he's a good pass rusher. He's like a DeForest Buckner light type of player and would be a really good rotation defensive tackle for that 4-man type front that this 49ers run. I always mess this guy's name up, but Fatukazi, I'm going to go with, bro. It's from the Jets. What he is a big interior defensive lineman, run stuffer. He's really, really good as a run defender. He's pretty one-dimensional, though, but he is really good at defending the run. So that's what you could say about him. If you need to upgrade your run defense and you need a big mother you-know-what to go in the middle of your defense, that's your guy for sure. Harrison Phillips is similar. Young still. I think he's like third or fourth year of his career, but he missed a year because he was out the entire year. But with Buffalo, you saw the difference between their run defense last year and their run defense this year, and Harrison Phillips was a big reason for that. He's one of those guys that doesn't get a lot of credit because he doesn't put up a lot of stats. He kind of takes up space and big run defender type guy, but he allows other players around him to be better, and that's the type of player that Harrison Phillips is. Sheldon Richardson, still very good, well-rounded player that doesn't really have any weaknesses to his game, has played in all systems, but is not worth elite money, but still was really good last year, I thought. Ndamukong Suh is way better than his grades suggest. I think he's still an excellent player, but he's going to probably demand a little bit more money than you're willing to give him, and it's probably going to be short-term. He is old, so you've definitely got to look for that. But he's a player that played like every snap for his team in Tampa Bay and is probably excellent as a number 2 interior defensive lineman, not so much a number 1, but he can feast as that number 2 guy, as he has beside Vita Vea in Tampa Bay, and is excellent against the run and can still get to the quarterback. Sebastian Joseph Day is younger, more so a run defender than a pass rusher, but has been pretty good as a role player with the Rams over the last 2 years. Was really good last year, wasn't as great this year, but can fill in as a rotation player. The only question I have about him is playing with the Rams and playing beside Aaron Donald. You can really feast and not be as great of a player as your stats suggest, so that's my only real concern there. And Brandon Williams is number 10. He's very one-dimensional, but he's very good at that one dimension. The Ravens were the number 1 run D, I think, at the end of the year. And a big reason for that is Brandon Williams. Brandon Williams and Calais Campbell held it down in the middle. He's a big 3-4 nose tackle, think Vince Wilfork. So if your team needs a guy that can just stuff the middle of the field on early downs and come off the field on third down, then he's your guy. So that is Brandon Williams. And the top 10 interior defensive linemen. Now, when we're talking about undervalued and buyer beware, DJ Jones is at the top of my list for undervalued. I don't think he's going to go for a super big contract, but he could end up being, like, within the next 2 to 3 years, a Pro Bowl type of player. I think he has that type of potential. Quentin Jefferson is just a veteran name that you'll get for a 1 year, like $3 million, $4 million contract. But I thought he was the best guy on the Raiders this year in the inside. And I thought he actually put up like 5 or 6 sacks, just constantly was getting some pretty good pressure in big moments, and is not bad versus the run either. So he's more so of that like Seattle scheme guy, but he is pretty good. Buyer beware, Larry Ogunjobi. I don't think his production, and this is where I say buyer beware for this position. Buyer beware for the interior defensive lineman is when you just see a bunch of sacks or a bunch of, tackles or whatever, and it doesn't really match how good the player is on down-to-down basis. And that is the case with Larry Ogunjobi and Jerron Reed. Both players have production and play a ton of snaps, but neither of them are very good. That's just my opinion. I think they're okay, but I think they're going to go for more money than how good they actually are. So that's where I stand on the interior defensive lineman. Let me know if you have any questions about that position. But I think it's pretty straightforward. A lot of pretty good players, and I could go down the list of players that I didn't even talk about that are pretty good that you're going to see teams sign. So at the interior defensive lineman position, just pulling up the list real quick, you've got guys like Linval Joseph, who's a big run stuffer. Austin Johnson, who's still young from the Giants, pretty good role player. Malik McDowell, who actually had a good year with the Browns, and more of a pass rusher, pretty athletic. Justin Jones, young from the Chargers. Bilal Nichols from the Bears. William Golston from the Bucks, who's a really good role player. Malik Collins from the Texans, who is the best guy for the Texans in the interior this year. Taylor Stallworth from the Colts, Taven Bryan from the Jags. So there's a lot of players there that, like I said, a lot of depth at this position that you could find some role players, but maybe not stars. The next position you've got to talk about is the edge rushers, which is always one of the more fascinating and big money contract positions because, after all, they're the guys that sack the quarterback. So you're going to look for these guys to get pressure. You're going to look for, in a certain system, more in the, let's say, the Ravens or the Patriots system. They're guys that are gonna drop back into coverage occasionally, but also blitz, but also defend the run. So they're very, very versatile players, athletic players, and depending on scheme, they're gonna play different, roles. Some of them are just straight uphill pass rushers. Some of them are more run defenders. Some of them are role players. But the edge rusher list. So these are the top 10 edge rushers. First, you've got Von Miller, who actually at the end of the season ended up being a top 10 and maybe even top 5 edge rusher of the past season and just turned on the Jets, man. So I really think that Von Miller is still awesome. I feel like he's got to be in a situation, though, where he can thrive off of another pass rusher. At this point in his career, I don't think he's a one-man wrecking crew like he used to be, but he's still really, really good. And he's good in all facets, run defense, pass rushing, etc. Chandler Jones, I don't think is the player he was like 3 years ago. Like, he's not going to lead the NFL in sacks anymore, but he still had 12 and a half sacks. And he's a really good pass rusher. He's not quite as good of a run defender, and he's not quite as good of a guy that can drop back into coverage. But he's a really good guy. If you just ask him to get to the quarterback, he's going to make 1 or 2 plays a game that change the game. So Von Miller and Chandler Jones are the best there that you're going to get short term that are going to be the most productive. And Von Miller, like I said, he's probably only going to want to play for teams that can win. Let's be honest with you. And Chandler Jones, I think he'll be open to moving from Arizona. I could definitely see him going somewhere else this offseason on a team that's probably in a situation to win as he gets older in his career and is probably looking to add accolades to his resume. Because believe it or not, Chandler Jones' resume is pretty darn impressive, and it's pretty close to being Hall of Fame. You've got Gregory, who and this is where the edge rusher list is very tricky. You could really have anyone from number 3 to number 6, and you could alternate all of them in different spots. I think the top 2 are pretty obvious to me, but I think the number 3 to 6 are really good players that you could, depending on your preference, you could rotate. So number 3, Randy Gregory is the most talented of the group in my opinion, but he's also kind of a dummy. And he does take a lot of penalties. So if you don't like that type of player, but if you like a guy that's going to change the game, and when he plays, he's really good, and he can sack the quarterback, he can strip the football, make game-changing plays. He's a huge reason why the Cowboys force so many turnovers. He hits hard. He's really fast off the edge. He's pretty good versus the run. He's physical, all of that stuff. Randy Gregory is a very good player. But he might not be worth the risk for a big contract just because he's been unreliable off the field. He's been unreliable on the field sometimes. So number 3 is Randy Gregory, and you could move him anywhere from number 3 to 6. Same thing with Harold Landry. He's had one really good year, which was last year, but I'm not sure he's exactly elite or will ever be elite, but I think he's very good. I think he benefited a ton from Jeffrey Simmons and the scheme of Mike Vrabel and the Titans, but I do think he's a good, productive pass rusher that can do a little bit of everything, defend the run, get to the quarterback, drop back in coverage. I've always been a fan of him. I wanted the Patriots to draft him whenever he was drafted 4 years ago or 3 years ago, but he's young, so that's a huge positive, and you could sign him to a pretty long-term contract because of that. I just wouldn't give him number 1 money as a number 1 difference maker on my defensive line because I think he's more of a complementary number 2 piece, if that makes sense. Emmanuel Ogbah has been really, really good for the Dolphins, but I wonder how much of that has been thanks to the scheme that he's played in with Brian Flores. And that's the only question I have about him is I think he needs to stay in that scheme. But in that scheme, he's really good. He's good, especially as a pass rusher. He can blitz a little bit. He's got some really good athleticism to him. He's really good at stripping the football from opposing quarterbacks and just generally making plays. And he was the biggest front 7 difference maker over the last 2 years for the Miami Dolphins and has been pretty cheap. Then you've got Hassan Reddick. Hassan Reddick is similar to Ogbah. He's a hybrid defensive end. Reddick is a little bit smaller than an Ogbah. He's more of I would say a finesse speed rusher. and he's not really going to be as good against the run. But if you want a guy that can get to the quarterback and can occasionally play even a little bit of coverage, you've got a nice hybrid player that's going to be athletic and do a lot of different things for you in a blitzing assignment and stuff like that. And he's really good as a number 2 when he benefits from Chandler Jones or Brian Burns in Carolina or Arizona, and he can put up a ton of sacks in that role. Jadeveon Clowney, I like him and I don't like him. So I think he's still really good, and he had a better year last year than I thought he did the year before, definitely. He actually kind of turned back the clock in some ways last year, but he's definitely a number 2, not a number 1. And you've got to deal with some injury issues. You've got to deal with him lacking of practice. He's not going to practice very much. But if you're willing to get over those things, you know that you're going to have a very productive number 2 edge rusher that is really good versus the run and is a steady contributor as a pass rusher. Jerry Hughes is probably, and this is where the tier drops. So you go Jerry Hughes, Melvin Ingram, and Nwosu. So these 3 guys are more like number 3 edge rushers. So you want to rotate them in on third down or rotate them in occasionally to get pressure. Melvin Ingram is that guy that can play on the inside or the outside. He's even played a little bit of stand-up outside linebacker, but he can do everything and he can get to the quarterback. I think he has more run defense ability than Hughes or Nwosu does. He's more well-rounded, but I think Jerry Hughes is the best pass rusher of all of them, and he's in recent seasons still been very productive, getting pressure at a consistent rate, and is maybe not a well-rounded overall player because he's just a little small, but he's very good as a 4-down defensive end for the Bills, and I think would be good in any sort of system like that for a contender that needs a spark off the edge as a pass rusher. So those are the top 10 edge rushers. Now in terms of undervalued and buyer beware. So undervalued, I thought Arden Key had a phenomenal season for the 49ers. Just like DJ Jones, underrated player. What I was impressed with, now Arden Key was somebody that I really liked coming out of the draft a couple years ago, and he never really worked out for the Raiders for whatever reason. I don't really know why, but he developed into a good player for the Niners this year, and what I loved about him this year is he played everywhere. He played on the inside, he played on the outside, and he was able to get a pass rush from all the different spots on the line. So Arden Key is still young and probably has a lot of potential to grow. Lorenzo Carter is like a different scheme. So Arden Key, you're going to want him if you're like the Colts or if you're like the Seahawks or if you're like the 49ers or the Browns. If you're that type of team, you're going to want an Arden Key. If you're a Pittsburgh or a New England or Baltimore, you're going to want Lorenzo Carter, or maybe the new Raiders defense, right? Lorenzo Carter is that type of guy where he could play outside linebacker, he could play defensive end, he could play inside linebacker, he can rush the passer, he can drop into coverage, he can do a lot of different things, blitz, and he could be productive in all those areas. And I think he's going to be undervalued because of that, because he doesn't have massive pressure numbers because he's not always pressuring the quarterback. But he definitely showed last year that he has a lot of potential left in him. Buyer beware, Jadeveon Clowney, just because of his injury history, just because of his he's kind of like a mercenary. Like I don't think he's like gonna want to always do the extra, but you know that he's good, and you know that you got to pay him, and he's not going to come cheap. So all those things about Clowney are a little irritating to me. But Harold Landry is on the buyer beware because I think I like him a lot. Like, don't get me wrong. I just think I wouldn't be willing to pay him in that elite category of edge rushers. The way that he produced this year, I don't think is necessarily how good he is. I think he needs to benefit from other players around him, not like the true elite pass rushers. He's not in that Joey Bosa, Nick Bosa, TJ Watt, Myles Garrett category of players. He's like in the second tier of players. So that's why I put him in the buyer beware, just in case a team does pay him that type of money. I don't think he's quite worth that. So those are the edge players. Edge rusher will be interesting. Definitely. I think there's a lot of teams that could always use pass rush, and that's what makes it interesting. But what also makes it interesting is occasionally seeing those players that I've never seen play in a system, and then they sign to another team, and they're playing in a totally kind of new system that I've never seen them play in. That seems to happen like twice a year, where I'm like, whoa, I didn't expect that team to sign that player. But hey, it happens every year, so we'll see who those players are this season. All right, so the linebacker position is next. I actually think there's a pretty good class of free agent linebackers, and I'm saying I'm surprised because there are not a lot of really good linebackers in the NFL anymore, because it's just really hard to be a linebacker in 2022. Because you have to have so much responsibility to cover and then also defend the run, and you have to deal with all the play action, and you have to deal with the screens, and you have to deal with all this stuff from an offense in the modern age. It's really tough to be a great linebacker today, because linebackers in the past, you were rather a faster guy that was like responsible for like cover 2 middle linebacker, or you were a downhill linebacker, and really you've kind of got to be everything nowadays, and that's why it's so hard to be a good linebacker in today's NFL, which might make them valuable, but also makes them kind of inconsistent, and you don't really know what type of production you're going to get from season to season. So the top 10 linebackers in free agency. Devondre Campbell is number 1. Given his recent season of production with the Packers, I thought he was phenomenal. He graded as one of the best linebackers in the NFL this year. And I've always been a fan of Devondre Campbell. He's somebody that, when you watch him, his athleticism and his ability kind of always has been something that I've noticed. But when you look at his production and his grades, they've never really lined up towards the player that I thought he was by the eye test. And finally, both of those things met in 2021 with the Packers, where he really did everything for them in terms of a sideline-to-sideline linebacker, in terms of a run defender, in terms of a coverage player. He's got enough speed to cover. He's got enough size to fill a gap and defend the run. He's got enough length, to get his hands on the ball and stuff like that. So he's just a really good player. And I think he's finally found that mix of understanding the game with his athleticism to match. Number 2, you've got Johnson from the Broncos, who's just a really steady, really smart contributor to the Broncos, probably very underrated. I don't think a lot of casual NFL fans know who this is, but he's been a really good linebacker, probably, borderline top 10 for the last 3 years. And I think that he's really good in that Vic Fangio style of defense. So he's somebody to watch to maybe get a bigger contract than the casual fan would expect. Alua Khan, who I always mess his name up, but that's the Atlanta Falcons guy that usually plays beside Deion Jones, if you're not familiar. Really good player. Actually, a lot of tackles this year, if I remember correctly. I think he was up there for tackles. I don't know all the stats off the top of my head, but I like him a lot because I think he's a modern linebacker. He can really run. He can cover well, cover a lot of ground quickly, and that's what I look for in linebackers nowadays. Most importantly, there's going to be flaws in your linebackers. Some might not be as good against the run. Some might not be as good in coverage. But I'd rather my linebackers be better in coverage than they are against the run. That's just my preference. And I think Alua Khan is that type of player, but he is kind of both. So he's somebody that's still pretty young, that's got some upside, that can come in and be productive. Jayon Brown. Brown is one of my personal favorites. I think this year wasn't his strongest year with the Titans, but like I said, he's got good speed. He's a little bit undersized, but he's always shown his ability to blitz and make plays downhill as well. So he's good downhill despite his size, but I think he's really good in coverage. And I think he would be a really good addition to a team that is looking for more speed at linebacker, but still needs a guy that can fill a gap and still can blitz and do those different type of hybrid things. Anthony Barr is a player that I could see in any system. He's got enough athleticism to play in a coverage-based system. He's got enough size to play as a downhill linebacker, but he's just always been a good player, and I think maybe has been overpaid at times and things like that, but still good. Number 6, Dante Hightower has lost a step, but I still think he's an upper echelon run defender at his position. He's not quite the coverage player he used to be or the athlete he used to be, which is a concern. but he can still be really good as a rotation player and probably also as a pass rusher at times and a blitzer. And he's very smart and also clutch. Anthony Walker for the Browns was really good, I thought, just fulfilling what they thought he would be, which is a steady force at linebacker. If you're just looking for a steady upgrade, say you're the Philadelphia Eagles and you just need a little bit of better player, that's your guy. Like, he's not perfect, but he's not bad. You're going to get solid production from him, and he's better at coverage than he is really run defense, but that's the area that a lot of teams need an upgrade. White from the Chargers is really athletic and decent all around. Probably also more of an athlete than he is a size guy. Van Der Esch, he is interesting. I mean, very intriguing. I could see a lot of people falling in love with him because he's got a lot of raw ability, but he also has shown to be a little bit shy from physicality at times. And if you put him in the right spot, right, in the right system, I think he can thrive. But I also think, like, if you expose him, he's not going to be great. Josie Jewell, he got hurt last year, so I didn't know really where to put him, but he's a smart player, productive player, and just a well-rounded overall linebacker that could upgrade a lot of teams. So that's the top 10 linebackers. Now, in terms of undervalued and buyer beware, we've got Jayon Brown, who, again, I just always liked. I've put him in my top 15 linebackers for probably 3 or 4 years. And I know he didn't have as good of a year with the Titans this year, but I think he's kind of unheralded and underrated. I'd personally love to see New England sign him. I think he would be great. He's actually the cousin of Willie McGinnis, I believe, or the nephew of Willie McGinnis, I should say. But yeah, he's really, really good in all facets and can do a lot of different things. And he's still pretty young. I think he's 27. Josie Jewell, just like I said, didn't play this year, so he might go under the radar, but when he has played, he's been really productive. Buyer beware, Leighton Vander Esch and Dante Hightower. They're big names. I don't know if they're quite the player they used to be. So those are type of linebackers that can definitely be killer, because linebackers can sometimes get way too much money based on name value and based on past production. And that's not a great way to measure a linebacker. So those are my linebacker rankings. Now, are there any other names that I missed that I have here? So there's some other guys as well. There's actually a lot of depth at this linebacker position. So past the top 10, you got guys like KJ Wright, who can still be a rotation player. Jawan Bentley, who's a good run defender and a smart player. Quan Alexander, who's more of an athlete and a pass player. Josh Bynes, who's been pretty good for the Ravens a couple times and the Bengals. Kenny Young, who's more of an outside linebacker / inside linebacker. Jamie Collins, who's still pretty darn athletic and probably more of a pass player than a run player. Christian Kirksey, Landon Roberts, Damian Wilson. All these guys are in free agency and can still play a role on a team. So that's the linebacker position. The safety spot. So safeties. This is one of the most stacked positions in free agency. And it feels like it's always stacked because there's just so many good safeties in the NFL in the modern age, I feel. And the safety position, I think, is a really important position in the NFL because I think you need guys that can do everything. I think you need guys that can tackle. I think you need guys that can cover. I think you need guys that can play man, can play zone, can run, obviously. But I think there are so many different type of safeties and so many different defenses nowadays with, there's going to be split safeties. There's going to be post safeties. There's going to be guys that are free safeties, strong safety types. It's going to be box safeties. There's going to be guys that are more cover, deep safeties, that type of thing. So you kind of got to pick and choose. And a lot of the times I feel safety is a lot about complementing the system that you play and then also complementing the partner that you have. So, sometimes one guy will be more of the guy that plays in the box and one guy will be more rangy. And that type of thing. So we might see in future years here and in years now where we might see more coverage oriented players as opposed to box players. Box players made more of a comeback with the Seattle scheme because they're like an extra linebacker. But now you might look for more just coverage guys, because a lot of teams are now playing cover 2 a lot. So that might change the way that players are paid at this position. But in terms of the top 10 safeties, you have number 1, Jesse Bates, without a question to me, one of the elite safeties in the NFL. I know that his numbers didn't always align this year with where you would rank him, but I thought in the playoffs he showed how good he was, truly. He made a lot of plays, and arguably the best player, I don't even know if it's arguable, best player on the defense of Cincinnati. Just really good free safety. I think he can play zone really, really well. I think he's one of the best deep free safeties with incredible range and good in man coverage as well, but really smart, reads the ball well, breaks on the ball well, can pick passes off, break passes up, sideline to sideline, that type of free safety. Not an excellent run player, but he's not really asked to do that very often. Marcus May is very good because he has a lot of versatility. For the Jets, he's probably been a little bit under the radar just because he's played for the Jets, but he can play free safety or strong safety. He's a good tackler, good coverage player, and I just think he's always around the football no matter where he plays. Like, he's a free safety that can come down and can make plays as a run defender as well. Marcus Williams, he's still young, and these 3 guys at the top are still young, and they've got lots of years ahead of them. So you got Marcus Williams, who is mostly just a deep free safety, but he does it really, really well. He's very smart. He's very responsible. I think, he's the type of player that his stats won't indicate how good he is, but he oftentimes, you don't see the Saints get beat deep, and that's because of Marcus Williams. Tyrann Mathieu, I don't think is the player he used to be, but he still adds versatility to his secondary. He adds fire and leadership to his secondary. He's not quite the run defender he used to be, but he could play nickel, or he could play free safety or strong safety. He definitely dropped off this year, though, so that's why I put him at number 4. He's probably going to look for a 1 or 2 year deal, and I could see him leaving Kansas City. I think he was fed up with that defense. Quandre Diggs, really good ball hawk, is still a decent age, and complements a in-box safety with his mostly zone coverage skills, but really good in Seattle, has played really well. Devin McCourty is at 6 because he's old, and because he probably only has 1 year left, or 2 maybe at the most, so that's why he's at number 6, but he's better than number 6. He's probably number 3 or 4. But he's just old. But he played really well this year for New England. Still can make plays on the ball, but just one of the smartest players in the NFL. Not just at his position. He's a great leader. He's a great culture guy. So a team that, even if it's not New England, a team that needs some culture or some leadership or some experience and a really darn good free safety, especially post free safety who plays deep, that's your guy. Justin Reed, really underrated player. I don't think he had his best season, or graded to have his best season, but I still think he's awesome, and I think he has a ton of potential. He's got really good feel for breaking on the football. He's got great speed, great range. Not a great tackler, but yeah, I think he could be a value because I don't think he's coming off his best season because he was on such a terrible team. But Justin Reed could be a good ad for a lot of teams. Jordan Whitehead is really good, and he's very unique in this modern age of football because he hits like a linebacker. He's probably one of the heaviest hitters in the NFL. He can really, really hurt people, hitting people. And he's not bad in coverage at all. You could probably play him as an in-box linebacker on sub packages, but he could be used as a tight end, man cover player as well. So Jordan Whitehead is young and can make plays. That's for sure. Kareem Jackson is old and has declined. So that's why he's at number 9. I don't think he's as good as he used to be, but still has versatility and definitely smart player, definitely good tackler. So number 9, he can still start. And number 10, Jaquiski Tartt, really good player when he plays. He's had a lot of issues with injuries, but good all around. I don't think he has many weaknesses in his game. He's just not elite, I would say. but more so a strong safety than a free safety. So then you look at the undervalued and the buyer beware players. Undervalued, Jordan Whitehead and Justin Reed. They're young. They've got lots of potential, and they're both totally different. So that's why I put them at undervalued. Buyer beware, Tyrann Mathieu and Kareem Jackson. I think they're both older and they're declining. So that's why I put them at buyer beware. Kind of obvious. Just, being safe there. But there's lots of players at this position that I didn't even include as well. So when you look at the other safeties, there's Jabril Peppers, who's awesome. Anthony Harris, who's still okay, a more so free safety, ball hawk type. Keanu Neal, who's more of a linebacker than anything else. Rodney McLeod's declined, but still probably a good third safety. Tracy Walker, I almost put on my undervalued list. He's really good. Jerron Kearse from the Cowboys, who's almost made my top 10. Really good player. Had an awesome season for Dallas. Really, really, really good season. Malik Hooker can still play. Deshaun Elliott is a decent low-end starter. Bobby McCain, who can also play nickel corner. So there's so many safeties here that are good players that I like, that it was really hard to make a top 10. But yeah, there's a lot of safeties available out there. So that's the safety position. The corner position is even a potentially crazier position to evaluate because of all the different schemes across the NFL, all the different types of corners in the NFL that you will find. Big corners, small corners, shifty corners, press corners, zone corners, man corners. So yeah, there's a lot of different type of corners. Now looking at the top 10 corners. Number 1 is by far J.C. Jackson. J.C. Jackson is arguably the best corner in the NFL, in my opinion, and you can call me biased, whatever you want, but that's my opinion. I think he's arguably the best. I actually saw one of the NFL reporters who I guess was evaluating J.C. Jackson tweeted today. He said, does J.C. Jackson have a flaw? So that's the type of player you're getting in J.C. Jackson. He is not only one of the best ball hawks in the NFL, but he's also one of the best man cover corners and zone corners in the NFL. So that's what he was saying with does he have a flaw? Because he could literally fit any system. If you play zone, he'll fit it well. If you play man, he'll fit it well. If you like press corners, he'll fit it well. If you like a guy that doesn't get beat deep, he'll fit it well. Pretty much anything. The only thing JC has not done is play nickel a lot. But he does play in the nickel because of the amount that the Patriots play man coverage. So he'll be asked to track another receiver a lot. And the only real receiver I've ever seen him give J.C. Jackson issues is Stephon Diggs. And this year I thought J.C. did a better job on Diggs than in past years. But yeah, this was his best year of his career, and he's been one of the best corners in the league for the past 3 or 4 years since 2018. And he's still only like 26. So yeah, he's going to get a lot of money. Carlton Davis is my number 2. I think he's arguably a top 10 corner in the NFL. And just like JC, I think he's good at pretty much everything, but he's just not as good. I don't think he's as athletic as JC Jackson or as a ball hawk as JC Jackson. That's probably where you don't see him line up with JC, but he's good. He's really good in press man. He can play number 1 wide receivers. He can play zone really well. I thought last year he played better in zone than he did man. He's a good tackler. He's a smart player, and he's only like 25. So yeah, he's a number 1 corner in the NFL. Stephon Gilmore is older, but he is still very good. He's probably still he's around the top. It depends, but he was coming off an injury this year, and when he played, still played really well. And just like JC, can play in any system. I don't think he's quite as physical as he used to be. I think he's not quite as fast or quick as he used to be, but he's still so smart, and honestly could probably play safety as well if you put him in that role. But yeah, he's still really good and probably would benefit more from playing more zone at this point in his career than man. Casey Hayward is older as well, but had an elite season this year for the Raiders, and he's really good in that Gus Bradley Seattle scheme. So if you play that scheme, you've got basically a number 1 corner if you sign Casey Hayward. Charvarius Ward is really good in man, and I think he's underrated because I don't think a lot of corners are asked to be as physical and aggressive as Charvarius Ward is, but he still plays really well. So I give him a lot of credit, even though he does get burnt at times. I think that's just because of how much pressure the defense puts on him to play that type of style. Then we've got Kyle Fuller. And Kyle Fuller is more of a zone corner than a man corner, but is productive. He didn't have his best year this year, but I still believe in him as a number 1 corner, so I put him at number 6. He has been inconsistent over the last 3 or 4 years, but I still think, like, as a number 2 corner, I think he'd be really, really good. Darius Williams, again, inconsistent. You're not going to see many corners that are not inconsistent, okay? Because corner is just super inconsistent. But Darius Williams was really elite last year and was just okay this year. But I think a lot of it has to do with that teams just target him a lot because he's not Jalen Ramsey. So a lot of teams would just target him consistently. And he's put in a tough spot because he's a shorter guy and he plays on the perimeter. But he's smart and I think he's very responsible. And you rarely see him get beat deep. And yeah, he gives up catches, but like I don't think he gives up a ton of huge plays. So I think Darius Williams is really good. And if you get closer production to what you did in 2020 than 2021, you've maybe got a steal. Jason Verrett, you guys know, this guy's amazing when he plays, but he's hurt like every single year. So that is a trouble, but I had to put him in my top 10 because when he does play, he's a number 1 corner. At number 9, Ahkello Witherspoon was really good for the Steelers this year and had, I think, one of the lowest completion percentages allowed, or maybe it was passer ratings in the NFL. And I think every time he's gotten a chance to start, he has been good. You know, so like I don't really understand the disconnect between his production and how teams value him. But I thought he moved from the 49ers and to the Steelers and played well. So I got to put him at number 9. And then Douglas was just really phenomenal this year. I have my concerns about him moving forward, but I thought he was unbelievable for the Packers, filling in and is better in zone than man. But if you put him in the right spot, he's going to produce for you and is still young, believe it or not, because he's been on like 1,800 teams, but he's only like 26. So yeah, he's still kind of young there. So that is my top 10. Now, in terms of undervalued and buyer beware, my undervalued, I do have Carlton Davis and undervalued. And the reason I have Carlton Davis is because I don't think a lot of people realize how good Carlton Davis is. So that's why I put him at undervalued, because I think he should be valued as a number 1 corner, but I think he might not get paid that much. So he might be a value depending on like in the difference between him and JC might be like huge on the market, but I don't know if it's like that massive in terms of their actual ability. I'm not sure. Mike Hughes is a good player. I think he had a good season this year with Kansas City in a better system for his skill set. I think he's much better as a man cover corner than he is as a zone corner, and I think he showed that in Kansas City. Buyer beware, Rasul Douglas and Patrick Peterson. Peterson is old, and I think he still carries a lot of name value, as you saw with the Vikings when they signed him to a ludicrous contract this year for way too much money. And Rasul Douglas, he's had one good year. I can't say that he's very good based on 1 year of production, but that is just the top 10 corners. There are so many corners that are not even on these lists that I could show. So again, corner is another position where there's a ton of players. So going through the rest, Dante Jackson, still think has a lot of upside, very fast. If you can just get the right coach with Dante Jackson, I think he would be a very nice number 2 corner. Sidney Jones has gotten a lot better over recent seasons, especially last year for Jacksonville. I think he can play well in a number 3 type of role. Mike Hughes I brought up. Levi Wallace is, if you're looking for a number 2 corner and you need an upgrade at that spot, he can do it. He's not going to be anything better than that, but he is a number 2 corner, and there's no doubt about that. Steven Nelson, similar, very solid, kind of can play in any system, but number 2 corner, perfect. Robert Alford was better than I gave him credit for this year in Arizona and has proven that he can play in a lot of different type of systems, probably more zone than man, but regardless, has been productive. Joe Hayden, still very smart, maybe could move to safety or play in the nickel potentially. but has played really well in zone systems over the past couple of years with Pittsburgh. Eli Apple did have his moments this year. I know he's a meme, but he had his moments. Xavier Rhodes, if you have the right system, he'll be a good perimeter corner. And those are the perimeter corners that I find very interesting. There's still a ton more that I didn't even cover. And let's finish off the position breakdowns with the nickel position. So if you're wondering why I didn't bring up certain corners, it's because I have them in the nickel spot. So there's a totally different position that I don't think a lot of fans give credit for. So the nickel position is arguably the hardest position in the NFL to play, and it really doesn't get valued the way that it should. The nickel position is essentially the slot corner position, the slot receiver defender is how you would think of it, right? And there's a lot of different type of nickel corners. So there's guys like, let's say, Mike Hilton, okay, for the Bengals, who's like really good at blitzing, really good at defending the run, but also can cover pretty well. There's guys like Jonathan Jones who are more so just coverage guys. They're really good at man coverage, and they're treated as like almost the number 2 corner for their team, and they're that type of value. And these guys are a wide variety of different type of players that fit into this position. So let's take a look at the top 10 nickel corners. There's not as many of these guys because it's more of a niche position, but I wanted to break it into nickel corners because that's how teams sign these cornerbacks. When you're watching teams sign corners, you've got to understand that they're going to sign guys for perimeter spots and they're going to sign guys for nickel spots, and they're both different positions, and that should be understood when you're watching free agency and free agency signing. So the top 10 nickel players. Let's go number 1, Bryce Callahan, who's been one of the best nickel corners over the last 5 years. Play man or zone, really, really good, and I think could be a value this year because he's been hurt at times, but when he's available, he is very productive. K'Waun Williams is better in a zone system as he is with the Niners, but if anybody was wondering who the best corner on the Niners was, it was K'Waun Williams. It really is, and it really was, and he's good at everything. Plays man, plays zone, blitzes, run defense, all that stuff. He's physical. DJ Reed Jr. is super underrated, but played really well for the Seahawks. And if you're wondering who the best corner on the Seahawks was, it's him. Chris Harris Jr., still good. I wouldn't say he's great anymore, but has proven to play in any system, but probably would benefit more from zone at this point. He's just not as athletic as he used to be. Desmond King is still good, and I think was super value last year. Justin Coleman had a bounce back year with Miami last season, back in the New England scheme. Chandon Sullivan for the Packers. Darius Phillips for Cincinnati, who can play on the outside or the inside, but I don't think, I think he's better than I thought he got play time in Cincinnati. Isaiah Oliver, who had a spark of showing something at the beginning of the year for Atlanta, but got hurt, so that was unfortunate for him, but maybe a value. Herndon for the Jacksonville Jags, who is a low-end starter at this position, but probably more of a number 4 cornerback type of player. So when you look at the undervalued and buyer bewares, DJ Reed is undervalued. I think he's going to be one of these guys that doesn't get enough money for how good he is, but young and proven to be pretty darn good in the Seattle defense. Desmond King, like I said, went for super cheap last offseason, and that's why he's undervalued, because teams have proven that they don't value him the way that they should. I think he's good. I'm not saying he's great or anything, but he has had an all-pro season before, so he's proven to be pretty darn good at times. But on the Texans, I thought he was solid, and he's played for a couple different teams now and been pretty good. Buyer beware, Chris Harris Jr., just because of the age, and Justin Coleman, because I've seen him be signed to teams and him not play well because he's in the wrong fit. So if you put him in the right fit, he'll be good. But you've got to put him in the right fit, or else it's not going to work, and that's where he can be bad. So that's my undervalued and my buyer beware players. Any other nickel players, I still, the only other one I included was PJ Williams on my list here for the Saints, who plays some safety and some nickel. But he's okay. So those are your nickel players. Nicholas Gill asked for kickers. I did not break down the kickers. I am not a kicker extraordinaire, but maybe I'll look at the kickers later on. But those are my positional breakdowns for offense and defense. I did not cover the special teams in terms of kickers and punters and returners. But I definitely will throughout free agency if, something happens. If a guy gets signed, I'll definitely talk about it. But it's not like I'm going to go out of my way to rank all the kickers. But so hope you guys enjoyed this positional preview for free agency. I'm going to have a ton more free agency stuff, so make sure that you watch out for that and check out the rest of the content on the channel. I got a lot of topic videos coming out. I'm grinding away. I'm constantly thinking of new concepts to do, and I'm really excited right now about the content, guys, because I'm starting to get back into this, I'm finding this rhythm of, topics and videos that I really want to talk about and, I'm really passionate about, so I look out for that stuff. I'm kind of getting into the zone a little bit, so look out for all the new content on the BLV. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. Appreciate all of you guys, and let me know in the comment section below which positions and which players, based on my description of them, that you think would fit your favorite team, or any players that I thought on my list that I overvalued or undervalued, and let me know where I was right or I was wrong. Anything you got to say, let me know in the comment section below. Gronk, spike that notification bell, and we will see you soon. Peace.